Let's talk tomatoes. Tomatoes are undoubtedly one of the most common vegetables that people grow in their vegetable garden. However, they're also the vegetable that people seem to have the most trouble growing successfully. And that's not to say that tomatoes are hard to grow per se, but they're definitely not like a set and forget type of crop. In other words, they need a little TLC. So today I'm going to share with you tips not only to help your tomato plant survive, but to thrive throughout the growing season. Fresh cut. First, it's important to understand there are two main types of tomatoes, determinate and indeterminate. And so for determinate tomatoes, kind of like the name would suggest, they get to a determined height. Most will top out at about 4 feet tall. Additionally, their growth habit is very different from indeterminate tomatoes. For determinate tomatoes, they will typically flower around the same time, usually within a few weeks of one another, and then fruit within a few weeks of one another. The main purpose of determinate tomatoes is to put on as many blooms and as many fruits in a short window of time. After that, the plant naturally dies off. An example of a popular determinate tomato are Roma tomatoes, which I highly recommend growing those because they are quite prolific. Indeterminate tomatoes, however, will continue to grow and grow until they're killed by either heat, cold, disease, pests, and if you live somewhere like me, all of the above. Indeterminate tomatoes have more of an ever-bearing habit, meaning they will continue to flower and produce fruit throughout the season, so as long as they are healthy. And this is going to dictate how we're actually going to be pruning our tomato plants. Because of its constant and very robust growth habit, pruning becomes exceptionally important with indeterminate tomatoes. Additionally, it's more of a quality game over a quantity game in comparison to determinate tomatoes. Let me show you what I mean. So if we look at this plant here, you can see we have the main stem. This is the main stem. And along the main stem, you have these leaves that form at almost a 90-degree angle. And where the stem and the leaves meet, this V here is known as the axil. Some people call it like the crotch of the tomato. And within this axil, you have this sort of side shoot that's at a 45-degree angle. And this is called a sucker. I would strategically allow some suckers on my tomato plants. However, you don't want to go overboard. Now, this sucker here will actually create a whole new tomato plant. Now, that may sound fine and dandy, but the problem with too many suckers, when this does produce fruit, this starts to take energy away from the tomato that it would otherwise use to focus on developing fruit. And so you will likely get smaller fruits than you would had this sucker not been here. Imagine if you had 5, 6 suckers on one plant, and then that plant produces its own plant and created more suckers. You can see the plant after a while will become way too big to manage. Additionally, you're creating the perfect environment for disease and pest pressure. I want to actually get rid of this sucker. And again, you can definitely keep some suckers on your plant, but I would definitely police how many you actually have on here for your indeterminate tomatoes. If you have a sucker that's healthy, disease-free, like this one is, you can actually propagate this to create a whole new tomato plant. And this will cut off 6 to 8 weeks when you compare to starting a tomato from seed. So this is a great method in your succession planning. If you want me to do a video to show you how I actually do that, let me know in the comments below. So because tomatoes are quite prone to disease and pest pressure, it's a good idea, regardless if you're growing an indeterminate or determinate variety, to keep the first, I would say 8 to 10 inches, you can even go to 12 inches, free from any leaves. This is going to help provide the proper airflow. So obviously I've not done any of that for this plant. So I'm gonna get in here and clean this up so you can see what that looks like. In addition to removing some of the suckers, I'm also going to be removing any leaves that are crossing over one another, as well as any that are growing in a funky pattern like downward. So I wanted to call out, this is a cherry variety. I believe this is a bumblebee cherry tomato. It's an indeterminate tomato. However, even though it's an indeterminate variety of tomato, I typically am very generous with my suckering, allowing suckers to stay on the plant with my cherry tomatoes. That is because the fruits are far smaller in comparison to like a slicer or beefsteak. And because of that, it requires far less energy from the plant to produce a mature fruit. So for cherries, I am more so worried about keeping the bottom foot or so free from leaves. So I have a little bit of pruning to do here, as well as trimming any leaves that are starting to cross over into other tomato plants. Outside of that, I don't do much pruning for my cherry tomatoes. So just wanted to call that out. I see you looking. Why don't you go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe. The next thing is fertilization. Now, plants like tomatoes are incredibly heavy feeders. And so even though I heavily amended the growing media, as well as I added some fertilizer in there, it still is going to need supplemental feedings throughout the growing season. This is one that is doing very well in terms of production. You can see this is a Sungo. It's putting out quite a bit of tomatoes. However, you can see that the green is starting to kind of lighten up a bit. It's not a deep green like this one over here, which hasn't started fruiting yet. And so that is because in growing big and tall like this, the tomatoes have used quite a bit of nitrogen. So I'm actually going to be fertilizing this with a liquid fertilizer, as well as a top dressing of a well-balanced slow release fertilizer. So on that note, let's talk a little bit more about fertilizers. Any fertilizer you buy, regardless of if it's organic, synthetic, or liquid, there's going to be three numbers, and those numbers are the NPK, which stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The nitrogen really is a workhorse for helping the plant convert the energy from the sun to photosynthesize and put on green growth. Phosphorus, so the P, is incredibly important as it relates to root development, as well as promoting flowering as well as fruiting. The potassium is going to be really important when helping the plant uptake the optimal amount of nutrients, as well as helping build up disease resistance. All are important, but you'll find that depending on the stage of a plant's life, one will become more vital than the other. Let's talk about actual fertilizers. Now, me personally, I prefer using organic fertilizers. However, that is completely up to you. One of the biggest cons for synthetic fertilizers is that over extended amount of times and usage, it can actually cause a buildup of chemicals and salt, which can have a negative impact on a plant's future health and growth. However, use what you have, what you can afford, and you have access to. My recommendation is that if you're using synthetic fertilizers, make sure you're following the application directions as specified by the manufacturer. So I use two main types of fertilizer in my garden. The first is a slow release organic, fairly well balanced fertilizer. And so with slow release organic fertilizer, it isn't an instant feeding for your plants. The way it works is that the microbes in your soil will actually break this down over time and make the nutrients readily available for your plants, again, over extended period of time. Throughout the growing season, I will typically apply this to that wasp just flew in the camera. Did y'all see that? Rude. Now he's pollinating my tomato. Stay over there. I will typically apply my slow release organic fertilizer maybe every 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the needs of the plant and just how kind of much of a heavy feeder it is. So for my tomatoes, I'll typically apply this every month. The other type of fertilizer I use is a liquid fertilizer. And the good thing about liquid fertilizer is that once you apply it, the nutrients become readily available to the plants instantly. And because my plants look a little low on nitrogen, I'm actually going to use one that has a higher N number. This is a 511. And this is actually a fish fertilizer. I know y'all going to ask me, like, what type of fertilizer, like what brand to use. And quite frankly, I just get whatever's the cheapest at the time of when I'm buying it. However, I will put links below to some of the ones I've used and have had really great success with. Let's talk pollination. For the most part, most things that fruit require some type of pollination process to actually, well, produce fruit. Lucky for us, the flowers of tomato plants are actually self-fertile. This means that they have both male and female parts required to produce fruit. They're commonly pollinated by pollinators like bees, flies, wasps, list goes on, but they're also commonly wind pollinated. Now, there are a lot of videos here on YouTube that show you how you can hand pollinate your tomato plants by getting an electric toothbrush and putting it over the flowers, but who got time to do all that? Instead, what I do is, as I'm walking by my tomato plant, if I feel like it needs a little help with the pollination process, I will simply just give it a gentle shake for a few seconds, and that's it. However, if you have your heart dead set on pollinating your tomatoes with an electric toothbrush, have at it. Tomatoes are actually vines. This means to set them up for success, they're going to need some type of support. There are countless ways you can support your plants. However, my absolute favorite way is using cattle panel for my tomatoes, which I can just help along as they grow by weaving them in and out the actual cattle panel. However, you'll notice I have other methods I use as well throughout my garden. I like to use T-posts because they are readily available, fairly inexpensive, and they will last a lifetime. And they are very heavy duty and can support the weight of a full-grown tomato compared to something like those bamboo stakes, which for me don't even last a full season because they will decompose just with all the heat and humidity we have here. Another method is simply using a heavy-duty tomato cage. I love this one. This will actually support the weight of a tomato in comparison to those tomato cages that you get at like the big box stores, which aren't great, especially for a full-grown indeterminate tomato. However, there is a way you can DIY it by like connecting several of them together. However, I'm all about working smarter, not harder. And so I just invested in this full-size tomato cage that goes pretty tall. And then I have this similar concept. This is the Titan tomato cage, which I just got this in the mail. I purchased this because it was on sale, and I'm absolutely obsessed. This one, as you can see, is quite large. It's taller than I am, so that will support any size tomato plant. You'll also see a very popular method among YouTuber gardeners is that they will actually prune their tomato to one stem and train that main stem along a single string. You can do that, but again, I'm all about working smarter, not harder. And for me, that's just a lot more effort than it's worth. However, that method would be fantastic if you're someone who's very limited on space and you want to pack a lot more within that space. So let's say you have 3 feet of space and you want to maybe plant 3 full-size indeterminate tomatoes. That could be a good alternative for you. The biggest con for me is just the amount of effort at doing that. Like, I barely have time to do like the minimal pruning that I told you that I do on my tomato plants, let alone to come out and make sure that I am limiting my plant along one single stem. Additionally, with that, you are limiting the yield you will get for that from that tomato plant because, again, you're only growing along one stem. If that sounds like something that would be fabulous for you, there are tons of tutorials on YouTube how to set that up, but it's a no for me. So we cannot talk about tomatoes and ensuring they're thriving without talking about pests. They are undoubtedly one of the most pest-prone vegetables that you can grow in your garden, and they probably have the broadest range of pests that like them. So I'm going to take you through some of the common pests that you may come across on your tomato plants, as well as how to get rid of them. I have had about 99.99% of the pests that I am going to talk to you about. I will not admit which one I have not had, because I will undoubtedly be jinxing myself, and this year I'll get an infestation of them. This is a group of caterpillars that can wreak havoc on your tomato plants. One of my favorite and most effective means for getting rid of caterpillars is simply using Bacillus thuringiensis, aka BT. BT is a naturally occurring soil bacterium that's toxic to some insect larvae, namely caterpillars. The way it works is that once the insect ingests it, the spores from the BT disrupts their digestive system, preventing them from being able to feed, so essentially they starve to death. BT doesn't instantly kill off the caterpillars. Again, they do have to ingest it, and this process can take a few days. If you're wanting an immediate solution, my go-to is soapy water. To make my soapy water mixture, all I do is mix 2 teaspoons of soap into a spray bottle of water. Mine is 24 ounces. Not everyone is a fan of using dish soap for this, and some would use something like Castile soap, which would technically be the organic way to do it. However, I am fine using good old Dawn. If it's good enough for my dishes, it is good enough for the bugs on my plant. However, feel free to do whatever works best for you. I personally have not found the Castile soap to be quite as effective as using the dishwashing liquid. Here's a grouping of other insect pests that commonly attack tomatoes. The good news here is soapy water is still a very effective means for getting rid of everything here as well. If you're not on the soapy water train, you can also look up things like spinosad and pyrethrin. However, I have not found them to be nearly as effective as my soapy water. The next must-do thing is mulching. Now, mulching has several different benefits. For one, it's going to help suppress weeds. It's also going to promote moisture retention, as well as helping insulate the soil and protecting the roots against fluctuations in temperature. Additionally, as the mulch breaks down, it will provide nutrients to your soil. Now, there are no shortage of mulch options. You just want to make sure you are using a natural mulch. That means if you're using a wood mulch, make sure it is undyed. You can also use things like straw, hay, burlap, grass clippings. The list goes on and on. One of the most common elements for tomatoes is something called blossom end rot. And blossom end rot is something that occurs due to a calcium deficiency. And this is most often triggered by improper watering. Makes sense, because if your tomato plant isn't getting the proper amount of water, it's not able to uptake the proper amount of nutrients. A good remedy for blossom end rot, obviously, is to make sure you're watering properly, but also ensure that your planting media has some calcium in it. So one of the things I do for all of my tomato plants is at the time of planting, I amend the planting hole with bone meal. However, bone meal does take time to break down and ensure that that calcium becomes readily available to your plants. However, my favorite way to amend my planting media with calcium is using a fast-acting gypsum. And what I really like about gypsum is, unlike things like dolomite or lime, it won't alter the pH of your soil. This brings me to my next tip, which is to ensure proper watering. At the same time, while you don't want to underwater your plants, you also don't want to overwater them. A good way to know if your plants are ready to be watered is to put your finger in the soil about knuckle deep, and if it starts to feel dry, it's safe to water. If it still feels moist, hold off a bit. Next is to succession plant. Succession planting is simply staggering out your plantings so that you can extend your growing season. I ended up having more tomato plants than I needed, so I ended up sharing with my neighbor over the fence and quickly realized she did not know how to or have most of the supplies to plant her tomato plants. So I went over, had some extra supplies, and showed her how to get her tomato plant set up. I know when you're at the nursery and you see tomato plants and they have flowers and fruits, you might assume that those are the best and those are the ones you should pick, when those are more often than not the worst, because if they are in a small starter pot and they are fruiting, flowering, they are stressed out. A plant's number one goal is not to feed us, although we do benefit from this process, is to flower and fruit so that it can reproduce. So its natural defense system in times of stress is to flower and fruit in order to ensure that another generation of the plant will survive. Once you planted your tomato plant, you want to allow it to get at least 12 inches tall before you allow it to start to flower. This ensures you're giving the plant time to actually develop the necessary root system to actually bear quality fruit. And so the easiest way to ensure that you have a thriving tomato season is to start off with healthy plants. It's important to know, especially if you live somewhere warm like me, let's just say hot like me and humid, during periods where temperatures are in the mid 90s for extended periods of time, your tomatoes will actually drop its flowers and stop producing fruit. In an effort to kind of mitigate this and just lessen some of the stress on your tomatoes, for me, usually it's like triple digits, and at that point, I just pull everything up and get ready to start all over in the fall. You can actually protect them with something called shade cloth. You can also use things like burlap. And if you're planting them in containers, you can simply just move the container around in an area in your yard that's a bit more shaded. So it came to me as I was filming this video that maybe I should do a video where I talk through troubleshooting common issues you might have with tomatoes. Let me know if you think that would be of interest to you. I thought about cramming some of that in this video, but this video is already too long. I really tried to get this under 20 minutes. I am sorry. It's just like as I was talking about one tip, I was like, oh, I should also tell them this. It feels important. So here we are. I'm hoping you found these tips helpful. I will say that tomatoes, of all the vegetables I grow in my garden, it is the one that is vastly superior in terms of taste when comparing to buying tomatoes from the grocery store. And as I said before, growing tomatoes isn't hard. They just need, again, a little TLC. And if you want to see how I actually plant these tomatoes, how I planted all of the tomatoes we walked through, I'll leave a link below to my video where I took y'all along and planted my spring garden. But y'all already know the deal. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell. And remember, every black thumb ripens to green, and it all just starts with a seed.